All right there. Good morning, everybody. I thought since we're watching a rather intense face-off at Brackenfell at the moment, I'd contribute something that I wrote on the topic of black nationalism this morning, particularly the idea of black fascism. Now, I think anyone who's looked at fascism a fair bit can realize that it's a concept that's often overstretched. But I thought, considering that it's generally used to refer to concepts of ethnic nationalism that reach some kind of homicidal fever pitch, with a strong authoritarian state as its sort of ideal form of governance. I thought this would, we can stick to the really sort of loose definition. But I wrote an article about a year ago, maybe a bit longer ago, I think almost 2 years ago now, about Mahmoud Mamdani. Now, if you don't know who Mahmoud Mamdani is, he's one of the big living intellectual giants of African political thought at the moment. And he's a Ugandan Indian. And so he wrote a fair bit about Idi Amin. But he's also a leftist and a decolonial scholar, which means that there are many aspects of his writing which I find distasteful. And I initially fell into him because he's extremely widely respected, and at the time I was fairly left-leaning. But after I dipped into him, I had a rather different picture of him. So I'll read you the article, and it's the language is a bit florid because I write differently from how I speak, but hopefully you'll be able to overlook how pretentious it sounds. Anyway, in the clearing smoke of the ashes of the Ancien regime, Mahmoud Mamdani was invited to teach at the University of Cape Town and to grow the African Studies department, to make it in his own image. He left in protest at the insufficient level of Africanization in the South African institution and wrote a now famous missive in criticism of the colonial legacy at UCT. While I was studying there, he made a grand return after the fall of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, openly offering his full-bodied and uncritical support to the Foyalist movement which tore it down. The unmistakable resemblance of this movement to the quasi-metaphysical racialism of interbellum Germany was entirely ignored as he strode past crowds calling for the slaughter of all white people in broad daylight. Perhaps one can chalk it up to naivete, but not in someone of his age, his intelligence, nor his particular expertise. The irony is not lost on me. I first encountered his writing during my obsession with the slaughter in Rwanda, which came 35 years after the Hutu majority had already seized power from the Tutsi minority in the little state, an interval of time ominously similar to that of the rise of the new black national socialism in South Africa, an equivalent distance from the transfer of white minority rule, give or take a few years. Mamdani, of course, saw, and still sees, no similarity between these movements, even though the language of the calls to violence and the promotion of genocide is far less ambiguous here than it was even at the height of the slaughter in Kigali. I called Fallism fascism, and I paid a larger social price. I was followed, got mocking death threats in broad daylight in front of my family, and was avoided like the plague by every white person in the academy, lest my stigma rub off on them. Despite the transparency of Fallism's racism, what with the valorization of bloodshed, the obsession with native soil, and the promotion of segregation, it was denied. But it is not the first time that fascism is manifested in Africa. The archetypal test case is Uganda under Idi Amin, first documented in these terms by none other than Mahmoud Mamdani himself. But true to his Marxist roots, Mamdani attributed all fascism to unspecified market forces, ignoring the fact that fascist governments' arbitrary confiscation of property, price controls, and introductions of state industrial monopolies were in fact extremely harmful and frightening to markets. But this generalization, together with a quasi-Leninist reading of the connection between capital and colony, allows him to attribute everything that goes wrong in Africa to what the kids these days are calling white monopoly capital. Worst, as he lambastes Idi Amin and dissects his vast ethno-fascist kleptocracy, he completely neglects to mention the similar system of revolutionary ethno-nationalism in neighboring Rwanda. Until the genocide broke out, Mamdani's only mentions of Rwanda were in passing, as a migrant labor force. Despite the mass exodus of the late 50s, due to a mass ethnic cleansing that saw approximately 100,000 Tutsi killed, Mamdani sees no reason to include this in his analysis, apostrophizing it as a political crisis. Mamdani calls his book on Rwanda When Victims Become Killers. Well, what does happen when victims become killers? When he gave his first lecture back at UCT after 16 years, the professor was asked what is meant to decolonize education. His explanation was that it meant identifying the categories being used to validate some facts and invalidate others, and to use this discovery to craft a different narrative. Unfortunately, the audience had already set about this process, but with the explicit aim of invalidating the humanity of settlers like me. So I think it is time for Mamdani to receive a little of his own medicine. Fascism is an easy concept to understand. It is a system of revolutionary nationalism in a modern state context, the totalitarian subjugation of all society, economic, social, and spiritual, under a state defined first by its ethnicity. This means that it shares many of the qualities of socialism, and even cursory examination of the early history of the fascist movements of Italy bears this truth out. Perhaps a cute way to put it would be to say that fascism is national socialism while Marxism is cosmopolitan socialism. Of course, if you know the history, you'll realize that this is extremely crude, and don't take that too seriously. Mamdani himself insists that fascism is some kind of false consciousness, as any good follower of Marx would do. It's just too easy. Fascists exploit the people suffering with revolutionary slogans, because, of course, the people are too stupid to tell the difference between real and fake revolutions. And the fascists are supported by the US and Israel, whereas the true revolutionaries are sponsored by the Soviet Union. One of the great consequences of this dichotomy for those of us living in the shadow of colonialism is that the colonial subjects and their successors have been dragged into this awful, stupid dichotomy, teased into believing that all evil is exclusively the domain of the European traditions, or wrapped into the ever-expanding definition of colonialism, that's the right, and that any struggle against anything in the name of revolution or liberation, the left, is good. True believers of the left, like Mamdani, attribute moral purity to their side, and they make out that any evil that comes into the world is the result of some impurity introduced by the right. This is a Western game which has defined the intellectual territories of European civilization since 1789. We, the left, are pure, and only when we are stained is evil possible. Eventually, of course, its material and spiritual effect becomes all too evil to be denied, at which point the leaders and intellectuals turn to accusing the people of becoming corrupted by colonialism. When used in political practice, this means a totalitarian and uncompromising crushing of any popular dissent to the revolutionary reforms, and the theft and cronyism of the elite, for which I suggest a cursory glance at Ethiopia, Tanzania, Somalia, Zimbabwe, or even South Africa today. If your plan fails, you just blame transnational capital for collusion with a third force, and when you write the history, you deny anything bad happened or accuse the black leaders of mimicry, which basically means acting like Europeans, copying European institutions, and so on. Ironically, one of the worst culprits of this farce is that champion of Africa, Mahmoud Mamdani. In writing on black fascism in Uganda, he cannot lay the slightest blame at the feet of any left-wing ideas from evolutionary violence to the one-party state. He cannot lay the slightest blame at the feet of any left-wing ideas, from revolutionary violence to the one-party state, ideological totalitarianism, or the vagaries of central planning. In fact, in a great ironic turn, he fails to notice the highest similarity between black and white fascists, their hungry insistence on economic autarky. After all, if he were to admit any even passing similarity in goals or tactics between true Africa and evil Europe, he would have to abandon his one-dimensional Manichaean approach to the scholastic analysis of the post-colonial world. He even finds time to defend Robert Mugabe, quietly glossing over the suffering caused by food insecurity, vicious totalitarianism, persecution, and ethnic cleansing of the Ndebele, which he doesn't write a single word about. The harsh game that is played by Mamdani and his intellectual kin is that there are only two grounds on which they are allowed to criticize each other. One, on the possibility of having not attributed a significant enough proportion of the evils of the world to the perpetual continuity of colonialism and whiteness, or two, of not offering radical enough solutions. In the case of my campus, energized by the Roads Must Fall protests, this accelerated from happy consensual non-racialism to genocidal rhetoric and Blut und Boden in just over a month's time, and with the aid of a bit of critical theory cynicism. Now even the Vice-Chancellor is in on the game. And of course, in the text, I'm referring to the event where Momakedi Pakeng congratulated Masaqole Mlandu on his thesis, which called for basically mass genocide, violent racial revolution as a solution to the white settler colonial problem. Yeah, let's not even go there. The left is radical skepticism, even radical suspicion to anything outside of its nihilistic aims, utilizing a scholastic synopticism of its own kind to present a united front, and when criticizing anyone within, degenerates into a purity spiral. This kind of totalized externalization and progressive radicalization of this kind of totalized externalization of non-left thinkers and doers may be all well and good for those countries seeking sound and solid identity in the wake of colonial abandonment, but when there are still settlers cluttering up the place, being externalized is not without moral consequences, and from my personal experience is not fucking funny. Zimbabwe got off light. They only had nationalism, racism, and thuggery, at least as far as the white population was concerned. We have a totalitarian, metaphysical, Manichaean ethno-religion embedded into every tertiary education institution promoted by half the ruling party and 3 opposition parties, each with an armed wing and active involvement in organized violence, such as land grabs. This is fallism. Mamdani is a part of this tradition and happy to be so. Arguing with such a single-minded individual must be taxing. Looking at an academic exchange with Martin Hall in 1998 reveals this queer passage. In correspondence with Mamdani, I have pointed out his misinterpretation of my argument, but he has chosen to persist with clearly incorrect reading. Why? Again, I think it is because he is determined to have the nature of the South African Academy conform to his expectations in citizen and subject. Colonial and apartheid education functionaries were obsessed with the mechanisms of control, separation, and subjugation, and Mamdani needs the mechanisms of academic support to look the same to conform with his theory. The contemporary university is the colonial regime in disguise. End quote. This is not to say that I disagree entirely with Mamdani's original critique of UCT, nor is this to say that Mamdani does not wield quite an extraordinary intellectual arsenal. One gets an almost giddy feeling reading most of his work. He can juggle with complexity like the best, and the ability to sublimate all spiritual blame for half a century of Rwandan slaughter and oppression and coolly crystallize it solely on the tongues of colonial administrators and scholars long dead is no mean feat, even if it is dishonest. He is responsible for creating that beautifully effective nation-building narrative, memorably expounded by Paul Kagame, that the colonial ideology of race is the prime cause of the Rwandan genocide. While I'm sure that he would, if questioned, deny that he is completely exculpating Africans from their crimes, that is, depriving them of the agency and responsibility in a high-handed neo-colonial fashion, one gets the impression that the ultimate sin of the Africans was not the killing itself, nor the hatred of their fellow man, but the mere fact that they were playing into the hands of the spirit of colonialism, at least as Mamdani conceptualizes it. This is in fact what he argues in When Victims Become Killers, and I quote, "The great crime of colonialism went beyond expropriating the native, the name it gave to the indigenous population. The greater crime was to politicize indigeneity in the first place, first negatively as a settler libel of the native, but then positively as a native response as self-assertion. To understand the logic of genocide, I argue, it is necessary to think through the political world that colonialism set into motion. It is in this context that Tutsi, a group with privileged relationship to power before colonialism, got constructed as a privileged alien settler presence, first by the Great Nativist Revolution of 1959 and then by Hutu power propaganda after 1990. This was not an ethnic, but a racial cleansing, not a violence against one who is seen as a neighbor, but against one who is seen as a foreigner, not a violence that targets transgression across boundaries into home, but one that seeks to eliminate a foreign presence from home soil literally and physically." End quote. Paul Kagame doesn't quite have this problem. As a politician, he is focused on practical means of holding on to power, extending his ability to stitch together a seamless new Rwandan social fabric, impervious to coming apart at the seams. As a keen student of realpolitik, he adopts whatever narrative will consolidate the national identity. The new erasure of ethnic differences adopted by Kagame is an even more simplified version of Mamdani's narrative. Hutu and Tutsi were more than exaggerations of ancient class divisions. They were pure fictions. Despite this, many people have long memories. Luckily, a class accent and a bureaucratic identity can be erased easier than skin color. Nevertheless, we all know it is in fact, if not always a visible fact, that Rwanda is a Tutsi minority state. Better than genocide, better than Habyarimana's ethno-socialist kleptocracy, but no happy Scandinavian social democracy either. Seeing as we have varying degrees of support for genocide in South Africa from several smaller political parties, be they the BLF, PAC, or EFF, and a vast Habyarimana-esque wing of the ANC led by the chuckling comedian Jacob Zuma, and I suppose now Ace Magashule would be the one in charge of that. I wonder what the answer Mamdani would have for those of us who saw the sinister forces accumulating and watched him waving what to the rest of us were like red flags. The truth is, he would probably say that somehow Black South Africa was provoked. Perhaps he would say it was an inevitable backlash for the humiliations that preceded. But what I am certain of is that he would refuse to acknowledge the Africanness of whites. In fact, since any violent confrontation that occurs will result in the generation of a white ethno-nationalist resistance, I'm fairly willing to bet that he will justify every cruelty against us on the basis that our only shelter will be bloodthirsty racists and unreconstructed colonialists. Of course, my position now is that should civil war happen, there's likely to be a minority front. But that's a conversation for later. Mamdani is much gentler a man than my classmates were, and certainly a country mile gentler than the men who carry out the topics of his study. But the path of absolutist logic in the process of apportioning blame leads down dark corridors. Quote, "I argue that Rwandan genocide needs to be thought through within the logic of colonialism. The horror of colonialism led to two types of genocidal impulses. The first was the genocide of the native by the settler. It became a reality where the violence of colonial pacification took on extreme proportions. The second was the native impulse to eliminate the settler. Whereas the former was obviously despicable, the latter was not. The very political character of native violence made it difficult to think of it as an impulse to genocide, because it was a derivative of settler violence. The natives' violence appeared less of an outright aggression, more of a self-defense in the face of continuing aggression. Faced with the violent denial of his humanity by the settler, the natives' violence became a counter to violence. It even seemed more like the affirmation of a native's humanity than the brutal extinction of life that it came to be. When the native killed the settler, it was violence by yesterday's victims, more of a culmination of anti-colonial resistance than a direct assault on life and freedom. This violence of victim turned perpetrator always provoked a greater moral ambiguity than did the settler's violence." End quote. I mean, sure, but you couldn't make this up. By expounding on his thesis that the Tutsi were transformed through the false consciousness of colonial concepts into alien settlers, and then saying that killing settlers is not only not despicable, but even an affirmation of life, he has strayed way out of the realm of humanity and into the center of Dachau to find his Jerusalem. Much like Frantz Fanon, Mamdani seems to believe that settlers are a separate moral category. In this context, Mamdani is explicitly diminishing not only the Hutu fascist culpability for the murder of his neighbor, but the moral wrong of the genocide itself. See, the trouble within his argument is that it is aesthetic. Ultimately, whether the victimization of the majority by the minority is real, as in South Africa and Rwanda, or imagined, as in Germany or Hungary, the motives and the actions are the same. It is only the superficial narrative that is changed. But as a historicist, it is the narrative that ultimately matters to Mamdani. He seeks to exploit the Fanonian theory of violence to ameliorate the moral burden of the third most brutal act of evil in the 20th century, by portraying it as a misguided act of post-colonial liberation. He quotes this famous passage from Fanon. This is the start of the quote. For the native, life can only spring up again out of the rotting corpse of the settler. For the colonized people, this violence, because it constitutes their only work, invests their character with positive and creative qualities. The practice of violence binds them together as a whole, since each individual forms a violent link in the great chain, a part of the great organism of violence which has surged upwards in reaction to the settler's violence in the beginning. As the old proverb goes, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. Mamdani has no criticism of Fanon at all, even when Fanon gets to calling for murder as a means of therapy. As far as I can tell, there's only one left-wing scholar who has ever challenged Fanon on this point, an Indian Marxist called B.K. Jha, who points out that Fanon's own clinical notes, Fanon was a psychiatrist, from his days in the psych ward, show the awful consequences of killing on the perpetrator, even when there is a dimension of colonial vengeance. Quote, Fanon's own psychiatric case histories prove beyond a doubt that the act of killing is dehumanizing and that it leads to neurosis and distortion of personality. An African militant had planted a bomb in a cafe, killing 10. Every year at about the same time, he suffered from acute anxiety, insomnia, and suicidal obsessions. An Algerian, whose own mother had been wantonly murdered, himself wantonly killed a white woman who was on her knees begging for mercy. As a result, he suffered what Fanon calls an anxiety psychosis of the depersonalization type. For this reason, Fanon's own deep understanding of such cases makes his theory of renovating violence more difficult to understand. End quote. It is not at all difficult to understand, though. It is informed first by a hatred of the other, and beneath that by an envious resentment of him. Fanon, since a young age, aspired to be accepted to high French society and saw himself as French. It was only through an encounter with real white France that he realized he was, in their eyes, merely black. Relegated to the back of the dance hall in Italian liberation celebrations and to the back of the Victory March in the aftermath of Paris's liberation, which is an extraordinary insult to someone who fights for you, my God. Fanon knew he was not seen as fully human by the society he fought for. It was only through reading Fanon myself that I realized what the Fallists had done to me, in a slightly less dramatic sense. Like Fanon, I came from a well-to-do middle-class family. I spent my whole youth looking up to heroes like Mandela and Sisulu, men of unwavering principle who I only wanted to take part in the great adventure of rescuing my fellow citizens from poverty, racism, and hopelessness. A mere bit part would have sufficed. I mean, these are the dreams they sell you in school these days under the new democratic dispensation. But with their borrowed American and German elites filtered through bitter race hatred and centuries-old ethnic grudges, my fellow South Africans made it clear to me in no uncertain terms that I was not their equal and did not deserve to live amongst them. Sometimes I dream that I have escaped the psychological South African exceptionalism that my folk have been accused of in Citizen and Subject by insisting that my dark brothers and I are equally capable of cruelty. But I sincerely doubt that I have escaped, since while my point of comparison is in Africa and my generalizations and concepts fall outside of race, I still see the inevitable curse of my caste, and that as something undeserved. When I encountered political difference, it is always attributed as a product of my skin color, And what's more, my interlocutor can always win the argument by threatening to kill me if I persist in disagreeing with him, which is not uncommon these days in South Africa when you're a youngster. This is not hypothetical, of course. Failure to recognize that we deserve to die is kind of difficult to get away with, even in some white circles these days. I mean, anyone who studied UCT knows how warped those people's personalities are. But so what does happen when victims become killers? The answer, according to Dr. Mamdani, is that they are immediately forgiven. Never mind the details, like the horrifying suffering of the people who lived through the troubles of Uganda, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Cambodia, or Central Europe. But Mamdani is wrong. Human beings are not the puppets of blind forces controlled by colonial masters. In fact, to say so amounts to a gross form of racism. His argument would lead anybody to the conclusion that when whites kill, they do it despite knowing right from wrong, but that when blacks do, it is because they don't know, like some lower form of life that cannot be blamed, children or animals. The reality is that actual human beings made concrete decisions to accelerate and participate in the insanity around them for the benefit of their egos and their short-term social gains, while manufacturers quietly stepped in to hand out arms, and the world turned a blind eye to the monumental task of providing moral judgment. And as he passed through the crowds of angry Fallists shouting, "Dabula Ibunu," so did Mamdani, now for the third time on his own home continent. Well, now, let me have a wee shifty at the comments. Ooh, buy a light polarizing sheet, someone says, that is sometimes sold as science toys, and tape a strip to the camera to remove the glare from the light. That's some sound advice there. Blood and soil without spirit, belief in God or transcendence, is just tribalism and will fail utterly. Well, that's an interesting perspective, but I suspect that that's a product. I think that really just comes down to, in my personal opinion, I think that just comes down to balance of forces. Sorry for the glare. I left my curtain open and morning sunshine coming through. But I mean, you don't really need to see my face. I'm just talking. The point that Lewis makes here about blood and soil, the tribalism versus some other kind of transcendent blood and soil thing. I mean, look, that's a kind of thing that a lot of revolutionary nationalists promise. They promise some kind of transcendent thing where you get to you do enough sort of cultural and spiritual renovation of the people through a consolidation of their identity through the basis of a common genetic sort of root and an attachment to a certain patch of soil. And there's the idea that this will develop the strength and revive the positive energies of the nation. And then you introduce sort of higher spiritual symbols to give them something to aspire to, that gives them structure to their moral fabric of society that'll grow out of it. And look, this is a process that many societies periodically go through since the dawn of time. But I don't think whether it succeeds or fails has anything to do with a particular spiritual formula. I think that many ancient societies were built on very, very brutal blood and soil tactics. And whether or not it was driven by any kind of spiritual thing is hard to tell. I think the interesting thing to look at is, so I was close enough to the decolonial movements in Cape Town to actually get a feel for what they're after. And the thing that you'll see a lot of the time is that they're not just aimed at material gain. So there certainly is a sort of distributive socialist angle to it. But what's extremely important is that the ancestor worship gets emphasized. And then what else gets emphasized is sort of native spiritual traditions. And they really, really strongly rail against Christianity. There's a small sort of like sub trend where you get people like Pastor Carlos Gosana, who promote the idea of a black-only church, and use biblical references to justify intergenerational collective punishment and things like that. But I don't think that there's a good distinction between revolutionary nationalists as purely spiritual and as material. I think that both components exist within the movement, and there are cynical atheists, and then there are superstitious spiritual atavists as well. And they tend to form a consolidation, and it's sort of like a bandit's compromise. It's an old classic. It's an old classic example in philosophy from the ancient Greeks, although Lord knows why I can't remember which one it was. But basically, the idea is that when you're pursuing the good, if you're doing it merely instrumentally, like a thief would, then when it comes to splitting the goods, you're going to fight amongst yourselves. And so in that respect, I would say Lewis has a point, in that if you don't have a higher set of goods that you're a moral good, that your political unit believes in, then it's going to be very, very difficult to consolidate a future order. But I'll say this: it doesn't need to be spiritual. It doesn't need to be explicitly, how should I put it, supernatural in nature to actually give a degree of longevity, because the supernatural will always re-enter the human sphere one way or another. I mean, you can just look at the disenchantment of the West, was immediately followed by the introduction of like syncretic spiritualism and occultism and the New Age movement and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, there's a great book on this by a man called Jason Josephson Storm called The Myth of Disenchantment. And it's fucking magic. Sorry to make the pun, but yeah. So even the Soviet scientists, they did like research into like how they could make spiritualist weapons. And so did the CIA, like psychic nonsense. Like people who you think are like these sort of dry science types, they get into all kinds of shenanigans. There was, you've heard of Jack Parsons, the famous rocket scientist, who was also a true believing member of Ordo Templi Orientis, which is the occult religious movement. The Church of Thelema is really what it is, which was developed by Aleister Crowley. Marie Curie believed in, spiritual seances and things like that. One of the most brilliant scientists of the modern age, and she's, so the idea that there really is a separation between the materialist perspectives and supernatural ones, I think is a false one when you're considering society as an organism. You can certainly see it in individuals, but it always the supernatural always intrudes upon the world again. And so I think if we look at the ANC and we look at how often in casual conversation people talk about the ancestors again, there is an anti-Christian rejection that you see a lot in higher echelons in the ANC. And I mean, it's not universally held. There are plenty of people who are serious Christians in the ANC, and plenty of people who are dismayed by the direction that they've gone. That's not what I'm getting at. It's more that when you look at someone like Cyril Ramaphosa, his allegiance with the ZCC is purely instrumental. It's purely instrumental. There's no. Here we go. Lars Solis jumping in here with a nice comment. I can tell you straight up that my peers are the most superstitious people I know. It comes with the territory of open mind. You know what? It depends where you're researching. If you're say, I mean, like I don't know where you're from, but if you're at say UCT, you're right in the middle of that sort of like hippy dippy spiritual crystal healing bollocks. And I met people from the science department who, swear by 6 joints a day and carry a crystal around their neck to make sure to ward off evil spirits. And you think like, you would have thought that by exposing yourself to a couple centuries of dry material ratiocination, that they'd kind of be they'd have a bit of epistemic distance from that kind of nonsense, but they don't. It's pretty broad, and the Anglo community in Cape Town is extremely New Age. They're extremely New Age, and they scorn Christianity. Well, I don't believe in that sort of superstition, but then crystal healing and homeopathy, and the natives, they know special things that we don't, and we shouldn't question the different knowledges. And my perspective is, no, okay, just take a break here. It's a different religion. So you have native Bantu religion, and it's animist, and it's ancestral worshipy, and in some cases it has sort of characteristics of pantheonic paganism. It's very, very complex. They have a very, very complex spiritual world that but your average Anglo is going to look at them and do that usual like white man's burden thing, where you chill there and you go, no, well, you see, we were so horrible, we imposed our backwards Stone Age beliefs on them. And you think for yourself, like, Christianity is so medieval. And you listen to that comment, and in my mind I'm going like, so what society are we talking about here in Africa? You so like the silliness of these comparisons. Like, people don't even put two and two together. They just sort of regurgitate these kind of like mantras that they've heard that trickle down through from the ages, from the left-wing tradition that's been dominating our society for 100-odd years. And it's just mantras. It's just like little magic spells that they regurgitate. They don't know. Thinking for oneself is very hard. But look, I don't want to go too far on that point, because it's no human being can completely reinvent their whole way of looking at life. You have to rely on things that people have said before, and to a great degree, you get traditional societies, even if they're very shallow traditional societies in the grand scheme of things. Like, I hope I'm not offending anyone if I say that the Afrikaans are an example of this. So their sort of folk tradition, their self-understanding of their folk tradition, is the Bible, and basically like a folk history that only goes back a couple of centuries. Right. I mean, it doesn't compare to something like what you'll find in India or Europe or China or Japan or whatever, where you're talking about millennia of continuous sort of social consciousness and so on. But they do have a tradition that they understand. They have sort of accepted beliefs that structure their society, that keep their people moral and having an idea of right and wrong. And people say they've forgotten their European past, like Prince of Parma here. But I'd actually insist that they have invented a new system. They're not Europeans anymore. They are a unique thing. And I would caution anyone in the Afrikaans intellectual community against trying to tie yourself to the European history, because the European tradition it's become corrupted. The left has lived on as a parasite for far too long, and Europe is dead as a civilization. What has replaced it is this strange global illuminist sort of civilization, which you see in like the UN, the WEF, and so on. And if you want to get really spicy, you can look at there's something called the United Religions Initiative. And the United Religions Initiative was it's something that's based in the UN actually fosters the sort of unification of all religions and so on, and so it gets quite hairy. But yeah, Prince of Parma, they have forgotten. I don't know. I don't think they've forgotten why they left Europe. The founding myth of themselves as refugees from wars of religion in Europe is very sound. They know where they come from. I mean, my ancestors are Huguenots, and they're pretty clear about this. So we were persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church. We came to South Africa as refugees, and we set up with nothing but our physical labor. And I mean, look, I'm very I've got detail of what my family got up to, and the long and short of it is, you say, well, built, cleared the fields with my hands, and then saved up to buy some slaves, and that's pretty much what it is. And then, of course, the British free the slaves, so you just start paying them a salary, and things move forward, and it goes from slavery to feudalism. And from feudalism, it becomes what we have now, which is like this weird unionized stuff that goes on. Yeah, but society, South Africa has always been too pluralistic to really characterize according to these big like paradigm shifts that Europe has. It's just little pockets you can give characterizations to. No, but you say, okay, so Prince of Parma here, saying that most Afrikaners only have a memory back to the Second Boer War. Well, that's a lot like, Americans who will have their memory going back to the Second World War, or to the Civil War, or to the Revolutionary War. And it's interesting. You can often judge. You can often categorize people politically by where they find that 0 point of reference, where you had that because at each of these points you had massive constitutional reforms in America, right? And so you've got people that sort of see their community as being founded in the civil rights movement, some who see it founded in the Second World War, some who see it founded in the abolition of slavery, and some who see it as founded in the fight against the British monarchy. And then, of course, there's a tiny, tiny contingent who say that the whole thing was a farce and they should have remained under the British Empire. And those would be the neo-reactionaries, but there's not too many of them. And I think the same counts for South Africa. Where do people draw the line? Where do you say we are founded? So some people say we haven't founded the nation yet and exists as a coming revolution. So those would be your EFF, your very radical sort of RET branch of the ANC. Then you'd have people who say we were founded in 1994. That's most of my generation, most people who signed the 96 Constitution. And that's the majority of the society. They say 1994 is our founding. And then there's people who go further back and they'll say, no, we were founded in 1910 with the Union of South Africa. And that tends to be people who take a very raw, realist perspective and see South Africa as a false construct. And it's a perspective that I tend to take myself. Others put it back to the Afrikaners might see their community as founded in the Boer War, which united the Cape and Plattelandse Afrikaners in the same struggle. Some push it back to the Great Trek. Then those are Afrikaners. Those are Transvaalers. Those are, they've got a different, the sort of Boer versus Kaapenaar distinction, which of course is very crude. There's more differences in the community, but you can have different foundings, and it tells you an entirely different way of who you look to for your heroes, where you look to for your values, what the aim of your society is. And so at each of these levels, you've got to see, where do people define themselves, and yeah, as Lars Solis says, Cape Afrikaners might have a memory stretching back to the Second Boer War. It's a very good dividing line, because that's a point of unity amongst different Afrikaners. But the real question that we're going to have to face, and because right now a lot of the countries talking about Cape independence, and particularly now if you look at the Brackenfell riots that are about to pop off today, there's, from what I'm hearing on the ground, people are carrying pangas, some people are carrying pistols, police have come out in enormous force. And all of these different people who are showing up at this movement, there's the Cape Party who've put up a tent and a banner, and they're saying, hey, look at us, we're out here, we're providing a solution, handing out t-shirts. There's a great little shot of Willem Petzer sitting there with a Free the Cape, whatever it is, Cape Party t-shirt. And yeah, no, Jack Miller is really maximizing his impact there. And I think it's very interesting. We had this conversation from we had this conversation with what's his face? Oh God, what's happening to my brain? I need to have a bigger breakfast in the morning. But this conversation was brought up by a fellow who posted to Facebook and was shared around Twitter, but a coloured fellow who said, very duidelijk, he was saying, okay, the people down Brackenfell, eintlik, they are not white. They're not like white people. They're brein van binne, okay, and they're licorice all sorts. They're basically coloured people who just happen to look white. And I thought that was an interesting observation because I recently recorded an interview because, I do that thing for the Young Cape channel. So I did an interview with Mansell Upham, and I did an interview with Anas Masail, and I'm only popping those out both today. That'd be really good. And I think later with a former lecturer of mine called Adrian Guelke on deeply divided societies and so on. But there was that particular observation of the Brackenfellians as being like pale coloreds sort of became quite a strong point because N.P. van Wyk Louw's big observation about the deep flaw and sin of Afrikaans society. There's a part where he sort of glosses over. There's a sort of part where the focus amongst people who into N.P. van Wyk Louw sort of passes over the conflict between black and white, which I think a lot of people tacitly keeps your brain fresh. Omega-3. Okay, probably just eat some more smoked salmon or something if I can find some magic money lying around. Anyway, the what was I talking about? Yes, the Clearing vraagstuk. The Clearing vraagstuk is the biggest part of N.P. van Wyk Louw's sort of philosophy that applies today, because that whole little community that we have in the Cape, and what Mansell Upham keeps touching on, and what his whole work is showing the genealogical interweaving of white and colored, and white and queer and Malay and black and Japanese even, and there's some really exotic sort of admixtures down there in the Cape. So he talks about this sort of weaving together of the communities at its base. And N.P. van Wyk Louw's thing is, look, we have a reckoning to make, which is that we have bruin Afrikaners who we haven't incorporated into our community. We haven't welcomed them in. And they are our cousins. We did fight alongside them. We built nations with them. And so the question really becomes whether or not you can actually embrace that kind of this variegated community as a minority front against black National Socialism, because that's really the basis of it. And this is what makes Brackenfell so important, because Brackenfell becomes the touch point at which the black National Socialists have mistakenly picked a target which solidifies that identity, because it is a community where white and colored are integrated and share a common sense of community. And what that does is that they've basically threatened, majorly threatened the very basis of their claim to the Cape. So I think this is going to turn out very, 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 very well for the Cape independence crowd after this. Is going to be good optics for them. I mean, look, the media can try and spin things, but even they've had to admit that footage has now revealed that the EFF picked the fight first last time around. They initiated aggression. So it's very clear. It's very clear that who the good guys and who the bad guys. And to return to the essay that I just read out at the beginning of the stream, the reason that paying attention to these academics is important is not because they as individuals have power, although they actually do. A lot of them have the ear of major organizations, and they will provide rhetorical excuses and defenses for the policies that powerful people institute. That's the role of the intellectual, is usually to justify power, to justify the use of power. And Mahmoud Mamdani and his followers at UCT and people who, take a shine to him, they use his words, and they use Fanon's words, and they use Biko's words to justify a certain position. And and they define the intellectual community of South Africa for the upper middle classes, which includes people like the journalists and all of the nice, polite people in nice, polite management society, all of those nice work white people in their small office apartments in the southern suburbs or in downtown Cape Town, where they're saying, well, we really need to address our privilege. We really need to, recognize the pain of Black people. And really sort of painfully creepy, bloody voice of this. And all of these people understand the patterns of acceptable language based on what they get from the universities. The universities dictate the character of acceptable language for the upper middle classes. And those upper middle classes will bully and browbeat everyone into accepting theirs as the privileged narrative of social, what's it called? Social climbing, social mobility, upward social mobility. And this is how soft power functions in society, how ideological hegemony works. And so this is why when you look at the journalists, all of them insist every single time they write an article on they never criticize the ANC on the basis of their ideology. They always criticize the ANC on the basis of individual acts of corruption. When they criticize the EFF, they say, well, they misbehaved a bit. Well, they're corrupt. They're never going to say the ideology that underlines them is flawed, because that would mean, going against the very basis of the entire new dispensation, which is social justice. And as I like to explain, I like to chirp out ad nauseum on Twitter, social justice is actually just it's collective punishment and it's collective redistribution. And that if you look at the preamble to our constitution, it's baked in. It's the entire point, and everything is interpreted in light of social justice. Okay, and so this perspective that you sort of get from sort of the timid intelligentsia, I mean that's fairly normal. You get a lot of that throughout Western history as the left has advanced. You'll get people who will say, well, because this by definition is liberation, anything in service of it is good, even if it's like terror or torture, child murder, or raping or burning or destroying anything. And people don't look into history. People don't look into facts for any other purpose than to discover a way of justifying the onslaught of this program. And so, yeah, liberal social mobility is a lie. Aha, but it's not. It doesn't have to be true to affect people, you see. So the idea that everyone looks to those who have higher social status to them for cues on how to behave. So you check the people are getting ahead. Like, just think of it like a simple guy. Like, let's say you're 13 and you're like, imagine that you're a guy who wants to like make big bucks, and you're a 13-year-old and you're checking out the internet. You're going to look at all of those big, shiny, big buck guys who drive the Lamborghinis and hang out with the skinny, bronze, spray-tanned models with a very, very tiny little bikini tops. And you're going to say, yeah, I'm going to be like him. I'm going to wear his sunglasses. I'm going to wear his suit, and I'm going to wear, and then I'm going to talk about like trading and assets and like crushing it, brah. Does that make you money? No, of course it doesn't. And unless you're a real whiz kid, probably the best option to make money is to take up a trade: plumbing, carpentry, roofing, electricians' jobs. I mean, sure, but you should see the average demanded salary for even like a mediocre one in South Africa. So, like, and you compare that to what mugs like me do after they learn, after they go through humanities. You piss your 20s away, grinding away at the stupid degree. Sorry, I'm being too pessimistic here. I mean, but the reality is it's not really worth it. What the reason that we keep pursuing this is because we're told that this is the prestige. This is how you get ahead. This is what education looks like. This is what doing, and wisdom doesn't come from credentials. Wisdom comes from experience. Wisdom comes from experience. And the thing is, can't they pick up woodworking? Well, funny you say that. I got a late birthday present from my sister yesterday, which is a couple of these sort of Swedish wood carving knives. So if I turn out to have any talent at that, maybe I'll sell those. But no, I've only ever carved one thing in my life, and it was something I did while I was working on a construction site before I did my master's degree. I don't know if you can see this little lass, but she's it's just a little sort of like Madonna figure type thing. But no, I don't think. The problem is that we don't have an apprenticeship culture, right? So, look, if I had kids right now, and they were, I don't know, they were graduating high school soon, like they were literate, they were whatever, they know how to crack numbers. I'd say, look, do you want to go into a high demand sort of like mathematical thinky study kind of thing? I'd say, cool, go do engineering, go do law, go whatever, but make it vocational. I'm not paying for any other fruity nonsense like I did when I was a kid, because that's a bad choice. But I would say that it would be equal to sending them as an apprentice, go work for a plumber or a carpenter or an electrician or someone, and you shadow them around for 2 or 3 years unpaid, and you get them to write you a letter of recommendation, and so that you can put it on your CV, worked as a trainee electrician for this number of years. And then they're like these certification courses that you can get in some places, and you can just go do that, and then you'll pass it with flying colors. So to try and bring back artisanal labor, you kind of have to make the decisions yourself out of society instead of waiting for the government, unfortunately, because we're living under, you're living under some kind of dumb, like retarded socialist dolly track system at the moment, and it's not going to help you out. And they're going to say, oh, you can't work like that. Well, who says? What are they going to do to you if you go and decide I'm going to work for free? You can't do anything. And it's cheaper than university because your mom only has to pay your rent and your sort of like upkeep. And what happens to that is that you don't have to sit there. Oh yeah, dodgy idealist worked in construction for years before he did his draftsman diploma. Well, aren't you a lucky fish? That does sound like a good line of work, actually. I mean, I don't know. I'm nearing 30, and I'm sort of asking myself now, do I take the gamble and sacrifice another couple of years to do something vocational? Do I take that, or do I try against the odds to try and make something out of myself using the skills that I already have? And I realize that way is a very, very steep hill to climb. And I've seen very few people really make something out of that in a way that I would deem as respectable. So there are a lot of people who do like clickbaity nonsense, and they can do a fair bit of stuff. As YouTubers and podcasters and so on. But the guys I really envy there's still people like Justin Murphy and Otto Poll, although unfortunately Otto Poll's he's really underappreciated, and you should check out and donate to him, because that's Otto, Pohl. So he's an independent scholar who does historical research on Soviet Russia and the racial discrimination policies that they had, because they had a system very similar to apartheid, where they'd segregate Koreans, Germans, Cossacks, all kinds of people, and they'd segregate them into different groups and deny them access to jobs and all kinds of stuff on that basis. And what this is it's very, very underappreciated history. And Otto Pohl has done a lot of work on that, and he survives on tip jars like all independent scholars do. The other person someone else who's already doing very well at this is Justin Murphy. Justin Murphy's really, really good. He does like these short little videos, like 10, 15 minutes or whatever, and he'll be discussing an aspect of life and sorting your stuff out. And he's a philosopher, but he's really, really smart. He's not just doing sort of like life advice stuff, which is sometimes sound, sometimes eccentric. But he does real in-depth research papers into understanding polling of attitudes. He's done a paper on artificial intelligence. He's done a paper. He's done a lot of very interesting stuff. So he's pretty knowledgeable about it. Okay, back to the questions. So let's see. 1916. I bet I wanted to go to. Oh, I'm doing chemistry right now. Yeah, no, Solus Pharma does pay well, but you know what? The thing is that you actually have a hugely branching career. The second you've demonstrated capacity in any technical field, the amount of options are endless. So I've seen my father through the course of his career go from. So he worked on the Merchant Navy in his 20s, and then he came back and did chemical engineering. And with the chemical engineering, he's worked for food processing, waste management, petrochemicals, everything. And so pretty much every aspect of the chemical environment. And with an MBA, he went off and did. He went off and got into management. And so once you're out of management, you're someone with, you've got technical expertise, which means you can run technical projects, but you're a manager, which means you can run large organizations and do sort of, run the big organograms. So I'd say, look, if you don't want to work in soulless pharma, you can work in soulless anything, or you could do something interesting. I'm sure there are plenty of smaller companies that are doing very, very interesting stuff in chemical manufacturing. I mean, I know there's one of the biggest. There's a very, very interesting company. Sure, but I must remember the name. They do in America. They're very fast growing. They managed an 80% profit margin every year for the past several years, and they manufacture bespoke cosmetics. So some small company that's putting out a cosmetic line will approach them and say, I want a product that does this. And then they'll manufacture a unique bespoke cosmetic product, whether it's like foundation or hair gel or lip gloss or anything like that. And it's just like you've got this small, compact factory with only like a couple dozen employees. And you fill this nice little niche, and you can grow rapidly because, the cosmetics industry is very much a status-driven one, and so the amount of variety in that industry gives you all kinds of opportunities there. So it's great stuff. No, do you see? Is this Mr. Patriarch? I believe, or isn't it? I can't read the names, just dots. Do you see a long-term future in SA? Do you see a united minority you spoke of as strong enough counter-resistance to the onslaught? That is the million-dollar question. I don't know. There's a chance for it, but there's going to be strong tensions within that minority front. There's going to be strong tensions. The intellectual elite of the colored community is largely captured by black revolutionary nonsense. So they've been turned into kind of an Askari class against their own people. And what I would say is as has the white elite, honestly, with all of this whiteness, critical theory, white privilege stuff. So there's sort of this big Askari education for minorities that's running about the place. What we really need to do is we need to actually reach out to traditional leaders and to churches and to mosques. That's where you'll find the intellectual elites that you can use to counter this, because they're not listened to, but they've got enormous stuff to say. If you look at people in the Methodist Church, in the Anglican Church, in the Catholic Church, yes, these institutions are corrupt overseas. But if you pick these people locally, these are people who are quite educated. Okay. And some of them might not, some of them might fancy the National Democratic Revolution, some might not. But it is one area that is underappreciated and undersupervised by the prevailing power structure. And so approaching them and giving boost to what they have to say is a good idea. Unfortunately, I don't see much comment from them. So on my list of guests, a couple of the people that I've reached out to are like religious leaders, but it's difficult to get hold of them because these are not people who are on social media pushing for clout. These are people who are running parishes and running mosques and running soup kitchens and so on. So yeah, Prince of Parma, they are indeed much better in terms of doctrinal faithfulness. The colored Catholic community, for example, is actually very rich, very educated, very humane, and very sound. And they actually have a lot of power in South Africa. They're comparatively wealthy. So there's a lot of that. I think the question with this is whether or not we can consolidate it, because the same pattern can repeat itself in an independent Cape. And I think that's where Lewis's observation about our chair's dodgy, see you around. But what Lewis said was that I thought was important, was that I picked up on, was the whole thing of like a spiritual core. That's going to be very difficult for United Cape. We're a pluralist society by nature. I mean, sure, Muslims are a minority, but they're not a minority you can ignore, because they're actually kind of elites. They're better off on average than a lot of other a lot of others in the colored community. Back in the day, they were a significant portion of the slave holders in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. And so you kind of have to think of these things in more complex terms. The Cape is way too pluralistic for you to draw any kind of one definition. But there's the problem is, you do have this sort of revolutionary consciousness, sort of native fascist movement that's afoot in some places, and you can sort of smell the sort of formative elements of it in some places. The real question you have to ask yourself is whether, let's say even we get to this long shot goal of ensuring some form of autonomy for the Western Cape, whether it's a form of independent government, or whether it's complete independence, or whether it's some kind of local autonomy that gives us power to enforce laws better, whatever it is, you then have to face the questions that the colored people are going to pose whites. And you have to face the questions that colored people are going to pose blacks, because those ethnic tensions will persist, because the colored people have two groups of settlers that they have not balanced accounts with yet. And when they're in the majority, they will have the opportunity to entertain those questions. And if we do not have adequate answers, then we are going to be paying for our silence. So I think the important thing to look at here is to say that the history is never over, and to not try and keep your eye on some distant paradise, but to just keep moving forward and keep sweeping the stoep, no matter how many leaves are blown onto it. And I think the one thing that we must try and stay away from is the totalizing pictures that Mahmoud Mamdani sort of offers, because that style of intellectual thinking has, I mean, it has its temptations. I can certainly see benefits in the way that I analyze the left as a tradition in Europe and the West. But it's It's one of those things where if you try and employ it strictly, you are going to have to use violence. If you employ it in a political program, the end road is violence. When you've got these hard, uncompromising clefts. There we go. Thomas Sowell, always with the wise shots there. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. That's true. And we're going to have to realize that the Cape is a country of horse traders. The Cape is a backwater of lower middle class Philistines. That's what we are. We have no natural nobility. We have to find a way to forge cobble together some Hong Kong second-rate aristocracy who can think for the people and give them a bit of direction. And you've got to plan mark, because there's not a lot of time. So we shall see. The amount of grassroots activity foreshadows the future. Well, keep your pulse on it. I think the Cape movement has a lot going for it. I think they should be doing much more to reach out to religious leaders. They are not doing enough. They need to be talking to the imams. They need to be talking to the priests and the pastors, and they need to be giving those people a voice, because those people have been shut out of policy making for ages. They've been shut out of policy making for an entire generation. And if they're from communities of color, to use the sort of the nasty little term, they've been shut out for much longer than that. So yeah, Cape independence is just a drop in the bucket. But I think the problem is that if you want to talk about the rest of the country, everything is just a holding pattern. It's managed decline at the moment. So I would be cautious of looking for hope to the rest of the country, unless you can find some way for the Zulus to turn around and say, nope, it's our turn to be free. Then I think a lot of this is going to founder. But if Zulu independence starts picking up, there's so much hope. Because even if no territory breaks away from South Africa, it'll force Pretoria to make compromises on all of its plans. They're going to have to rescind. They're going to have to rescind a lot of centralization of the state, and that means localization. It means lowering the tax burden. It means lowering the amount of welfare that's distributed. It means local enforcement of laws according to what local communities want. That means a reduction of corruption, or at least certain kinds of corruption. New forms of corruption always emerge, but you know what I mean. If you get the Zulus to stand up, and I honestly don't know how, I don't have voice in that community. I really don't. I don't have hand with anyone there. So, sure, but if you can press that button, it doesn't have to break South Africa apart. It just has to create. Why is the IFP so weak? Woof, because they have no testicles. Have you seen their public comments? They don't even take themselves seriously. I mean, the problem with the IFP is that they're not willing to strap on a pair of balls. They look there and they look at their share of the vote now that's been achieved because the ANC has used violence and corruption to oppress them. Okay, and they sort of they retreat, and there's a complacency amongst the Zulu aristocracy because they've been handed powers by the ANC. But the problem is that they need to feel the fire on their backsides in order to move. And they need to feel fire in their hearts in order to have something to move towards. At the moment, they don't really understand themselves that way. And they're sort of just let's lobby for maybe a bit more leverage, No, they need to become real firebrands, because they're there for their people, and their people are getting absolutely chirked, by Pretoria. Pretoria is corrupting that whole province in the most extraordinary fashion. Not that it'll go away, I don't think, after Zulu independence entirely. It'll take a very long time for them to fix that. But that sort of competition between IFP and ANC, that's creating enormous incentives for corrupt competition. So, yeah. We need expats to talk about Zulu independence. Locals will most certainly be silenced. I've been told many times we don't talk about that out of safety concerns. The ANC, that's true. I mean, the KZN is the home of the vast majority of political assassinations in South Africa. It's just the truth. So whatever you check out that side, it's people live in fear, and they need. Do you know what would be? The thing is that the one thing about a monarchic system, even if it's a constitutional monarchy, is that there's a psychological function that the political system can perform that republics can't. Now, the only way a republic can, KZN was the bastion that protected Zuma, but Zuma is he's a weird fish. He's not actually a true believer in the ANC's ideological program. I don't think he's even a light believer. He doesn't give a damn. He's a pure Machiavellian from that perspective. But he does have his own values. He does value his own people and their culture, and he does have loyalty to it. And so I would say that Zuma's sort of like he's an IFP member who accidentally joined the wrong party. So, yeah, I think that's kind of why that he succeeded. He cut IFP support literally in half. 50% of their votes disappeared when Zuma ran for president. But now's the chance, because you've got Ramaphosa in charge, and Ramaphosa has no ethnic base there, and his multiculturalism and open borders stuff, and the scale of his corruption makes Zuma look like just it's ridiculous. So I think, look, this is the IFP's chance. They can gain enormously in the next elections, but they're sitting on their thumbs. What people on the ground want to hear is they want to see, because of course they protected Gumede, man. But here's the thing: this is universal. If people are looking for representation, if they're looking for a voice, they want to hear someone who's got a pair of balls, And I don't mean literal balls. I mean, why was Margaret Thatcher popular in the UK? Why is Reagan and Trump so popular in the US? Because they told people, I'm here, I see you, and damn anyone else, I'm not going to take any of your nonsense. And you mobilize people massively. But where are the firebrands in the IFP? I don't see them. I mean, I follow their Twitter, and it's just all of these like sort of tepid comments about some ongoing soap opera. No, you need to find your own issues and assert those issues into the mainframe. I mean, look, if you're fortunate, your enemies will pick. If you're fortunate, your enemies will pick a pressure point that actually unites you, like Brackenfell. Brackenfell's fantastic, actually. No, Thatcher has mixed legacy in the UK now, but when she was around, she was extraordinarily popular. Extraordinarily popular. And I mean, look, she was hated by unions in the North because she broke them, but she had to break them. She literally didn't have any other option. She wasn't even much of an anti-unionist when she came to power. But in trying to negotiate with them, she realized that she had no hand. So then she starts stockpiling all of the coal and stuff, literally like piling it up in parking lots and what have you. And after stockpiling everything, then she decided, okay, let's do a strike. And then she carried on the strike long enough that literally no union could hold out against the state. And they were broken because they were messing around with the actual, they were holding the entire country to hostage for unrealistic wages. You can't have that. I mean, we've got this in the in South Africa right now. Where the unions are now seeing the unions are now seeing that there actually isn't the budget for their sort of shenanigans now. The difference is that in South Africa, the ANC are willing to go full Zimbabwe before pulling the trigger on Kusatu, putting the dog down. So that's the real question. But you say the unions are holding the entire SA hostage for unrealistic wages. You're right, but it's more insidious than that. Which is that the ANC is seeing they pursue policies which create dependency on the state. So they hand out grants, and they make it so that you have most of the grants are dictated at a local level, but they're bargained for with Pretoria. So it means you've got a really, really interesting thing where if you're a crafty politician, you can get extra grants for your people. You can get free water and electricity and whatever. You can be very crafty like that. Or if you're a favored area like Soweto, you just get away with pretty much anything. And there's fat grants for people who have. Councillors will be receiving grants because they can adjust the level of the grant qualification criteria. And the idea is that they continually expand dependency on like this big sort of tripartite octopus. So they have to be part of the unions, they have to be a member of the party, and they have to be on grants. And you just keep expanding that, and those people will get fed, and everyone else will get slowly suffocated as they crush the private industries. And they do that through BEE, and they do that through regulation, and they believe in crushing it. And the reason is because of that comment that Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma said a couple of months ago, where she said that the ANC needs to be pursuing a policy of class suicide, and that's from another African revolutionary called Amilcar Cabral, and he said that you need to actually. The problem is that the middle classes will never support a communist revolution because they rely on the rule of law for safety and security and stability, and they rely on their property rights in order to secure a future for their children. You need to destroy these so that they will have solidarity with the revolution and see the revolution as their only answer to putting food on their table. So that's Amilcar Cabral. They need to commit class suicide and erase themselves as a class and join the homogenous democratic society. This is what you this is what you get. And so what I'm really looking at here is you have to see the ANC as a progressive capture of everything. That's what they're doing. And when they get hold of a private company, they run it into the ground, because it doesn't matter. It really, really, really doesn't matter. It's purely extractive. And when they're done, they can run everything as slave labor, like every other communist society does. You listen to the people on the ground floor in the ANC, and you mention the phrase "reserve labor army." Watch them get excited. They'll come to you, "Oh yes, and we're going to deploy people to do this, this, and this, and if they don't do it, we'll just chuck them away." So the way that you got to see how they imagine their future. If you talk to an ANC apparatchik, particularly one who's gone to university, those people are poison, absolute poison. Neo-feudalism. Yeah, well, I mean, that's why Hayek called it the road to serfdom, isn't it? And it's very clear. And the funny irony is that we actually have real feudalism in South Africa in about 30% of the population, living under elected chiefs and so on in various parts of the country. I mean, you couldn't make it up. It's like they decry the serfdom, but South Africa's always been a feudal society. We just haven't realized it yet. So if you look at how farm laborers are they're a serf class. Okay, sure, they're paid wages, but they live on the land under the farmer, under the landlord. They're allowed to have their own small holdings or what have you, much like a medieval serf would. And so it's sort of the whole of South African society is the vast majority of it is a feudal society and always has been. And the problem is white people, because of apartheid, were alienated from the natural class relations of South Africa. And I was having an interesting conversation with a certain somebody who was talking about the difficulties that the Afrikaans community faced when they were dealing with insourcing their own workers, like, that whole self-bestuur philosophy that like Orania has. So they want people who have good morals, who are willing to work, do their own thing, and so on. bloody hard. They say they get like tens of thousands of people applying to Orania to join, and they just have to turn them away because they have no resources to contribute and they haven't got the right attitude or values. And so it's a very tightly controlled community. And what you find when you try and employ, like, you get these like little white squatter camps here and there, like in Pretoria. Oh, sorry, sneezing. Not coming. But you have these like poor white communities in like Pretoria or what have you. And so those guys, if you try and employ them on the farm, they don't want to take instructions. They don't want to listen to you. And they'll tell you, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And they don't do it. And apparently, they're worse than Africans in terms of their attitude to work by a long streak, because they come from a society that was acculturated and accustomed to being dependent, that is, you have welfare, you have a job available for you. These are all guaranteed. You don't have to worry. You don't have to think too hard. So now they just become these sort of quasi-destitute, parasitic people, And so in many ways, you look at people in Joburg and you ask them, like, okay, so like people around Brixton, or the little poor white communities around there, ask an ordinary, like a working class, black person from there, like, what do you think of those people? Say, we don't talk to them, they're dangerous. So you think of the kind of like that weird kind of degeneration, that kind of modern degeneration that people of you sometimes see in the black community, you sometimes see in the colored community. We don't see it that often because they're smaller in number. But the white community who fell out of society in the past generation, they're as hard hit by it as anyone else. And so the degeneracy that you see in the West, where there's so many resources, it replicates itself where there are no resources as well. And those people will ride it out to the ground unless there is some kind of restructuring of people's consciousnesses. They have to accept selflessly that they're part of a community and realize that their role in it will not be the same as everyone else's, and that they may have to just pitch in. But that Protestant work ethic is disappearing fast. Even amongst the upper classes, it's seen as like, oh no, working hard, it's oppressive. I mean, I know nobody wants to work, but it's fucking don't do it. If you don't do it, then things are going to get swak. Feudal societies only seem to work well if said society is homogenous. No, I disagree very strongly. Politely but strongly, I very much disagree. Feudal societies work much more efficiently when there's a caste difference. Of course, then they become those societies are then very brittle. Okay, so they can persist with a great deal of stability for a long time, but then when there's a disturbance, they break like that. So yeah, feudal society can work if the society is superficially homogenous, but the reality is the classes in England and the classes, like, how deeply ingrained is that concept of the great chain of being? Feudal society, very, very strict. Everyone knew who the villeins were, everyone knew who the lords were, everyone knew who the serfs were. Yeah, like India. I mean, the thing is, you don't even have to have it as have as complex and as religiously inscribed a caste system as India had to have a caste system. The nature of English society for most of its history was something like a caste system for nearly 1,000 years. And there are remnants of it still. Remnants of feudal England survive into the modern day. Dukes, kings, queens, House of Lords, the City of London. Those weird guild societies that seem to run things so much. Very, very inaccessible, very exclusive. But London's a very complex place. Feudal societies tend to be ruled by minorities, even if it's a cultural minority or minority class. That's society. I'm afraid. Every society is ruled by minorities. The government is a minority of the people. And they always recruit from a certain sector of society that is recognizable to them, that has qualities that they recognize. So they recruit. So you look at the West, where they're recruiting from universities that inculcate a specific set of values and points of reference, and skills. Yeah. In the UK, absolutely. Iron Law of Oligarchy. Ah, there we go. Someone's been reading this shit. But it's the thing is that, oligarchy doesn't, the minority that rules doesn't have to be non-virtuous. I think the thing is that if you give people the power to recognize the structures of power as they are in practice, you can coerce them. But it doesn't just you can coerce them to behave, but you do require the extra ingredient of a lot of positive will amongst the people, a lot of positive attitude. They need to really believe they can do it, and they have to have a strong idea of how the leaders ought to behave. So you have to have people with a strict sense of norms and responsibilities and morality in politics and authority and so on. The people have to understand very clearly. And that's how you reinforce the Constitution, is by expecting it and by chastising leaders when they fail to conform to that expectation. But we don't have that, because our Constitution in South Africa, our lived Constitution, our living Constitution, it's not what's written on paper. It's this vast, complex, crazy thing. And it's like people, the people say about, like, for political science, they say about Brazil is not for beginners. I would say very clearly, South Africa is not for beginners. South Africa is difficult for people who are obsessed about it, even. Bloody difficult. Because if you want to understand South Africa, you don't just have to understand, oh, well, it's not just black and white, it's also colored and Indian. You don't have to even go deeper than that. Then you have to go, okay, so what does the colored community look like? Hugely diverse, complicated thing, with allegiances pulling every which way, saturates the Cape politics. And then on top of it, you've got like this, you've got to understand why Anglos are different from Afrikaners. You have to understand why Ngunis and Sotho-Tswanas have barriers. You've got to understand why the ANC and the EFF, what is their structural relationship. And it's too much. It's too much. You can't expect everyone to take time out of their day to follow all of that kind of stuff. And that's why you're going to have a minority of people, even of like the so-called intelligentsia, who are going to be following all of that. Not everyone can follow it. Some people are going to be law experts. Some people are going to be experts in a specific policy area. My thing is following power hierarchies and ideologies. How does power justify itself? It's and it is a mess, but it's fantastically interesting, because you get to watch the confluence of revolutionary party politics, feudal land ownership, racial discrimination, all kinds of exotic political phenomena. South Africa is full of some of the most exotic and complex political phenomena anywhere in the world. And people just ignore it, because they're like, well, the story is very simple. It's white privilege and black power. So they just ignore it. They file it away, and they go, well, things might look hairy down there, but if the white people didn't sin so hard, then everything would be paradise. We just need to press hard on black power. And that's the international perspective, because the international perspective is always stupid. Sorry for sounding so horribly bitter and spiteful, but I really, really, really am tired of it. You talk to people here in the Netherlands, and there's some very nice people, very smart, and very. The Dutch are actually probably the most well-balanced people in terms of how they look at foreign countries. They really tend to take a step back more than most people do. They're not so up their asses, but they also just don't know. And the nice thing is that they'll actually admit that they don't know, which is an unusual feature. But then the ones who go to the big shiny universities and you talk to them, you'll get responses like, well, it isn't your land and you took it, and that usual thing. But what I would say here is to remember that these people who form the ruling class, the people who are running the show in South Africa, have a very, very firm idea of what they want to see the future look like. And that future is essentially a graveyard. And I think that understanding, and this is the thing, if you've come in late, the start of this lecture, it is kind of a lecture. I'm just sitting here barking crap at people and taking questions. But the start of this little broadcast, I read out an essay of mine that I wrote about this African intellectual Mahmoud Mamdani, how he thinks about he talks about African fascism, but then he applies it in this very sort of intellectually dishonest way. It's the feature over here. Wait, managerial elite toaster. I actually I just recognized your name now. I've seen you on Academic Agents channel a bit. Yeah, no, nice to see a bit of cross pollination here. But yeah, Principal, I'm sitting on my soapbox. It's that's kind of what YouTube is for. It is soapbox television, really. Don the Plebs as well. Don the Pleb. He's such a nice guy. He's just like a genuinely just like nice guy, isn't he? He's so like just the easygoing, the like the can-do attitude. I really love it. I think people need to be more like that. But yeah, the thing is to pay attention to what UCT is saying, and you have to realize that they're your enemies. And I know that that's a really harsh thing to say, because they are human beings and they have their reasons for saying so. But there's a structural thing going on there where they see themselves as being the tools of enlightened progress. Okay. And UCT are the big trendsetters at a national level for how people think. And so when you look at how that university behaves, they started Rhodes Must Fall. Okay. Without that, Fees Must Fall would not exist. Okay. And they tend to drive the conversation on issues of decolonization and issues of reform and symbolic change and so on. And their offshoots end up in all sorts of places, all sorts of funny NGOs and things like that. And they're a very sort of UN-friendly organization. And so I think with UCT in general, what you have to realize that they are the people who for civil society, who are cracking the whip and making sure that people follow the correct codes. They're the people who go into your HR departments and design your critical theory education, awareness, do not have unconscious bias thingy. And from the one end, policing the minorities and the elites, you have the universities like UCT, and from the other end, policing the great masses and the other, and the strings of the underworld is the ANC. And so you have to sort of see both sides of this equation. And they are. It is a very, very vast machine, and it has a single end goal, which is the total submission of all elements of society to the revolution. And I think what some of my previous lecturers sort of outlined when they were talking about this, which they quite liked this. You should Google it. You should look this thing up. It's called Hegel and Haiti by this woman called Susan Buck Morse, and it's the usual sort of left-wing dolly track, but the symbolic feature of it, and this is why a lot of people at UCT love this essay, so they said that the highest form, the purest form that the revolution ever took was the Haitian Revolution, which was a revolution of black slaves against white masters, and they massacred every last white person. And so this is the ideation. And the thing is, intellectuals soft pedal this stuff. When you hear them in public, they'll talk about Like, I'm a very transparent guy. You can poke me any which way and I'll tell you what I've read. I'll tell you what I think of it. And I'll be very practical about it. But intellectuals in general, and the reason that I don't identify with most of them, is they have a goal and they're pressing towards it, and there's this with an absolute sort of religious fanaticism, but it's also a covert goal, because they know if they come out and say, look, I'm for complete totalitarian communism, I am for the unconditional submission of all minorities to the state, I am for the elimination of this, that, and the other, everyone will look at them and say, oh, wait, hang on, actually, this is quite nasty. So what they do is they justify amongst themselves mechanisms of, you create sort of micro justifications for, like, how should I put it? Imagine a big ratchet. You have a ratchet, you used a ratchet tool, right? There's lots of little teeth on a spring joint on the inside of the ratchet. And what they do is they build little ratchet teeth into the rhetorical framework of society. So they'll say, well, you can't say that because that's a compromise with racism. And this thing over here is racist, and that thing over there is racist, and this thing. And they target this whole sort of network of things from a negative perspective. So they don't just say, let's do communism, let's kill whitey. What they'll say is, well, capitalism creates inequalities, and this unfair system is intrinsically capitalist in nature. Or they'll say this system is intrinsically white supremacist and intrinsically racist in nature, or patriarchal and sexist. Doesn't matter how you construe it. And what you do is you constantly press towards this sort of unattainable utopia, instead of constructing positive values that you can actually hold people to account with. You construct universal means of accusation and deconstruction that all point in one direction: universal consolidation and centralization of power, and the submission of all difference to the engine of change. And so to learn to see how they utilize these patterns, you don't have to do it the thing is, you don't have to do it at such a too fine a grain. If you don't have time to do all of this intellectual nonsense, what you really ought to do is just look for the patterns. What do the intellectuals just generally sound like? What are the kind of things they promote? What are the things that they see are in the interests of their revolution? And you just notice the patterns. Don't worry about how they're reasoning, because all of their reasoning is actually instrumental. They have a single goal, and they're pursuing any sort of form of excuses that they can get to push towards that goal, which we all know is unattainable and evil. So just notice what the pattern looks like and avoid it and stand against it and stand resolved against it. And doing just that is kind of enough for most people, I think, just to have a bit of insulation. You know, if you really want to get to fighting it, that's much more difficult. The problem is that right now the distance between us and catastrophe is not that far in South Africa. Some people have hope. I have very little. There's so many just structural things that are up in the air, and things could go really, really awfully wrong. And so a lot of the mechanisms now is really just about noticing who your friends and enemies are amongst, like, political parties, journalists, so on and so forth, and saying, oh, okay, these are the people who think that I deserve to live and be free and pursue my own happiness and self-interest and care for my community. And these are the people who want me to hate everyone and want me to hate myself and want me to give up everything that allows me to have a future. And you talk to people, you organize with them, you meet them in person as much as you possibly can. It's very good. How far off until SHTF? Oh, shit hits the fan. Do you know what? That's actually really hard to tell, because what we're usually expecting is this massive, like, and then everything will go. But the Rwandan genocide is a completely unique phenomenon. Completely unique. No genocide in history has ever gone like that. Like, everyone just, like, that was like someone cooked a hand grenade and just chucked it at exactly the right moment. You know, you saw it coming with only a couple months warning. Okay. And when it hit, it was 100 days, 1,000,000 deaths with knives. Like, I don't think you can possibly comprehend how much, because let's say you look at some other genocide like the Holocaust in Germany. So that's 11 million people, 5 to 6 million Jews, and then some other people, making up the 11. Now, that happened over 6 years. That spread over 6 years. If they were doing that at the speed of Rwanda, you'd be talking about, that would take them a year. Take them a year to do. So Rwanda was much, much more rapid. And they didn't do it in the middle of an ongoing war. And if you look at the Second World War actually just sort of slowly slides into place as well. I mean, there was a long period where they called the war between the British and the Germans a Sitzkrieg, a sitting war, because there was very little mobilization either side for several years. And so what you're looking at South Africa is you're actually just seeing it's a totally different dynamic. You can't actually look at these historical examples for comparison because it's not the same. If you understand what's happening, just look at what's happening on the ground, see how fast it's moving, and see what dynamics are applied. Because, for example, if you look at the EFF, they have a modular strategy, by which I mean it's the same little part that's repeated and repeated and repeated. Yeah, the phony war. That's what Peter Hitchens called it. The phony war. The Sitzkrieg. But anyway, if you look at South Africa, what does the EFF do? Look at the ANC before it. There's a pattern strategy that they adopt where they target they don't see white people as being the state or not the state. It's always been the settlers, right? It's always been white people that they've been fighting against for the most part. I mean, look, there've been some fairly humane people in the ANC, but if you want to see like how why the attitude is different, there was a fantastic little excerpt from an old 90s interview with Cyril Ramaphosa, where he said he was describing seeing Rolf Meyer dance for joy when the apartheid government came down and lowered their guard. And he said he was absolutely flabbergasted and astonished. He said, if that happened to me, I wouldn't be celebrating. My God. Which makes you wonder, what exactly was he using? Was he seeing Rolf Meyer and similar white people as? The strategy that they employed over time is you try and instigate an inhumane response from your opponent that you can use to leverage sympathy for your cause and justify an extreme form of violence and retaliation. That is precisely what they do over and over again. And so they started by teasing the black. The EFF has started by teasing the black aristocracy amongst the ANC. Sorry, the black oligarchy, I should be more specific. Because if I say the black aristocracy, then you're thinking of the lords and chiefs and kings and people. Anyway, so they pressured the party and they did most of their protests against the party for a long time, but they've completely shifted focus. They moved from targeting the party to targeting the private sector, H&M, clicks, so on. And with Senekal, they entered an entirely new phase. They're no longer targeting businesses and government, because business and government are now aligned with the National Democratic Revolution. Okay, they're now doing soft targets. So they're going to places like Senekal, and they're saying, we support the people who murder your children. That's what they're telling us. We support the people who murder your children. And then they come to Brackenfell and say, look, your children have to accept us. We get to tell your children who they associate with. And we all know it was just a private party. People were invited. Those who showed up, showed up. That's what the Brackenfell High Schoolers did. There was no matric dance. They had their own little private matric dance. They invited who came. Who came, came. No black students picked up. Well, I don't know what you're supposed to do about that. Only 42 people showed up at the party. I mean, you can easily imagine that happening in any community, right? The response is, we know what the response is. It's got nothing to do with any real grievance. They're not mad. They're not stupid. They're coming to tease you, to elicit a response that they can use in the media. And everyone in the media, because of what they're raised on at university, knows exactly how to respond. No frenemies. No friends to the right, no enemies to the left. And that little formula, very, very easy to follow. So every journalist came out and said how disgraceful it was that the parents viciously attacked the poor, peaceful demonstrators. The thing is, they don't need to be told by their editors to say this nonsense. As much as, I mean, as corrupt as News 24 is, I don't think they have to actually issue instructions. They just hire people who fairly woke from UCT. Those people will fight tooth and nail to make sure that any contrary fact is buried. Because, it has to reflect the lived experience. And of course, it comes out now that this is slander and that the EFF are the ones who started throwing punches and rocks and shit. And this is outside. This is your children. Like some people say, oh no, it's because Afrikaners love their children. No, everyone loves their children. If you touch people where their children live, no one can maintain a measured temperament when their children are threatened. Nobody can. And they're banking on that. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or false. In fact, I think that everybody knows that this wasn't racist. I think that the vast majority of people actually know that this is not against racism. But it's a pure exercise of power. Much in the same way that plenty of people who go to church and plenty of people who worship God do it communally without really believing. But they see it as a necessary structure for society and society's morality, without which all would fall apart. So even people who are not true believers will believe. And this is the structure of belief you have to see in the general population of South Africa in their support for the EFF. They don't believe that the white people, they are racist and deserve to be punished. They just defend the power structure and advance its cause, because white people in general, as a rule, they understand, need to be shown submission. They need to be brought to heel and to be made into a submissive caste who do what they are told. Problem is that with the high unemployment that you see in South Africa, they can't use white people for labor. They have no interest in white people. White people, once whites are divested of their land and of their liquid property, they have no use. Do you understand? And if you listen to people like Vusi Thembekwayo, not Vusi Thembekwayo, Vusi Nkukantobi. Don't confuse it. Thembekwayo is a good guy. He's a very sound man. But Vusi Nkukantobi, what he does is he argues that look up this article. You really should. I'll probably put it in the description or something. But it talks about Makanda, the prophecy of Makanda. Yeah, their bloodlust goes beyond demanding submission. But we know that that's what the dream is. The dream is that of Makanda, which is sweep the white people into the ocean. But the way that they demand it is they say, remove white people from their land, remove white people's cattle, their property. It's all about land and cattle. So you take recompense by depriving white people of all rights, all property. Okay, what do you do with white people once you've done that to them? What do you do with them? And when you see that what they've done is that they've left out the conclusion. So they say they argue for every single individual piece of a genocidal puzzle except for the act of killing itself. And so what you're seeing is this comprehensive picture that's built around saying that everything you believe, everything that sustains your very core being, your ability to earn food, your ability to provide for your children, the ability to provide for your culture's survival, your language's survival, everything has to be undone to the last detail. And that is decolonization. And once they've deprived you of absolutely everything, the right to even demand that your very body be respected, that your access to food, your access to self-sustenance is taken away from you, everyone recognizes that those rights are negotiable now. Okay? That is the most moderate position in the entire country, even amongst most of the white community, is that our right to life is negotiable. That is the right-wing position. Okay? The left-wing position, the progressive radical position, is that no, you don't have these rights, you must give them up. Okay? So when you look at the political landscape, what you have to realize, what is not being said, is that nobody is saying we are human beings, God damn it, our lives have value. There's not one person amongst the white community saying this. Okay, the Boere, for example, they're probably the only people in the whole country who are standing up and saying we don't deserve to die. Everyone else is cowardly. And I understand why we're all cowardly. I've been cowardly for the fucking past few years, for crying out loud. I've been afraid to say it because you're so cowed and conditioned by years of being told that this is the only direction we head in. And the sinister double talk that you get where you promised, no, we'll all be equal. We just have to balance the books quickly. Just go stand there outside of the community while we reorganize utopia. You cannot trust that. It's absolutely despicable. And so look, the lesson here is very simple. You have to realize that you have to stand up and say, we deserve to live unconditionally. It is not worth negotiating. And the means of our existence, the means of our survival, are to own property. We have to own our property. Okay, we have to have an inalienable right to that property in order to sustain our right to live in the country of our birth, in the country of our ancestors. Okay, and if you accept that is negotiable under any circumstances, then you run the risk of letting yourself be killed by your own permission. And yeah, jihadis can convert. White people cannot peel their skin off and paint themselves a different color. We can't burn our pass cards that say that we're Tutsi. We have our pass cards, our Tutsiness, etched into our skin like tattoos. So our skin is in this game, I'm afraid, in more ways than one. And the way that we solve this is not by reaching to some stupid European thing. Because you know what? Those white supremacists, they're not your friend. They don't care about you at all. You're a tool in their propaganda program, and they would love to see you die because it would excite them back in their countries. Okay? And yeah, I mean, it's fight or die, but it doesn't mean picking up a gun and shooting a person tomorrow. Fighting is 99% of the fight all the time is up here. It's spiritual. It's being able to hold the gaze with your enemy. Fuck, I wish I could find this. Let me see if I can find this GIF. I'll share my screen and show you. I know this but I think it just demonstrates, um oh, where is it? Here we go. I'm just gonna share my screen because this is just really, really cool. Oh, come on, load. I really hate Chrome. Chrome is a bastard. But the basic point is you've got to realize that even tiny little animals, okay, if they are fearless, they'll back off animals many times their size. Many times their size. If you're fearless and you refuse to accept that you are food, you've got to refuse to accept it. And if you don't refuse to accept it, then you will be trampled. It doesn't matter what you do. Oh, bugger this. I'm not going to share the screen. It's just Chrome is just being an absolute nigh right now. But hi, Jonathan Paul. I was actually talking about you earlier. I mentioned, I actually encouraged people to go to, oh no, Jonathan Paul? Yeah, Jonathan Paul. Jonathan Otto Paul. Yeah, that is who I think it is, isn't it? Yeah, I encouraged people to, go and contribute to your channel, your research. But yeah. No, what I'm saying is basically this is an act of will. If you're in South Africa and you're a white person, don't lean towards the look. You have to have a bit of you have to show solidarity. You have to. You have to show solidarity. You can't accept that you're supposed to be this, that, or the other. But we're not Europe. We're not America. We can't do that. We can't play this like super white nationalist game at all. And the people overseas, as I say, are not your friends. They will not support you. They will see you as a propaganda tool. They want you to come and replenish their bloodline overseas. Okay. And we know that the amount of people who can afford to leave South Africa are not that many. Okay. So if you want to do good and you want to resist this, and no end in history is ever certain or predetermined. Nothing is ever certain. Just be strong and don't become hateful. Just become hard. Don't let people pass you. You just hold your gaze, you hold your ground, you say, no, this is wrong. It's not negotiable. You have to have a bedrock that is not negotiable. It doesn't matter what laws or excuses or anything anyone comes up with. You do not negotiate this line because this is your life. This is the life of your children. This is your life of your neighbors. Okay? So your right to property and your right to be a citizen, you're not negotiable. Not negotiable. Because you will end up like the Tutsis. Because the Tutsis had their property taken away from them first, and then, 150,000 of them massacred? 30 years later, they're still eking out a shadowy existence with no rights and no power of entry into the political system. And when they try and demand their rights back, they get slaughtered. And so Lewis, the problem is that the black people are ahead of you in all of this blood and soil, race consciousness nonsense. They're way ahead of you with this, and their spirit is much stronger. And the thing about that is, it's actually, in my experience, watching people who have that mentality where it's about the blood and the soil and not about me and my family and my future and my neighbors and those people and these things that I can touch. When it's about these big abstract ideas, people are fickle. They're capable of great violence, but also great cowardice. And if you want to see an absolutely perfect illustration of this, yesterday's protest at Brackenfell with the PAC, they showed up, they talk about killing everyone, and they stand up and they say, high discipline, high morale. 1 second later, flashbang goes off and they sprint into the distance like a bunch of pussies. So the courage that you're given when you get this kind of like big idea nonsense going around, where you're attached to some kind of abstract ideology. Some people can find zealotry in this, but people don't really kill just for an idea. The idea organizes how they see their targets, sure. Okay, it organizes, family is the baseline. Yeah. And but in the Cape, white people and colored people, there's no clear meniscus. There's a lot of sort of intermingling. And the thing is that you're actually going to have to press on that to survive, because recognizing the unity between the continuity between white and colored, and reconciling these groups, and realizing that they have the same history. This is going to be necessary for survival of both groups. Yeah, I have read Evola. He's a bit fruity for my taste, I'm afraid. I understand where he's coming from, but it's very heady stuff, and it's very sort of like ooh but it's not all of it's very practical. I mean, some of his suggestions about the need for like youth incorporation into stuff. I mean, I don't think who hasn't like gone to a scout troop, who doesn't see the value in like that kind of stuff, that kind of like youthful ontgroening process. Yeah, so I don't see much use in Evola. He's just a bit. I mean, he's interesting. He's interesting to read, but I don't get a lot of like solutions for problems to them. I really just think it's you've got to realize that a lot of this is about will, it's about confrontation, it's about bargaining skills. And really the person that I would say is the most useful to refer to is not any of these big ignore and remove the Anglos. Dude, you're going to need the Anglos because they got all the bloody money. Okay? They're fickle, perhaps. And the other thing that you're going to find is you have to convince them to join you, because if they don't, they have the power to betray political movements on a scale that no other group has. I mean, the coloreds could get a bit like double-edged about things because they don't compromise on what's in their interest. If they see something in their interest, they're very, very strong about this. This is right. This is wrong. Anglos they'll sell their whole family to the gas chamber for a noddy badge from the president. So I don't have you can't remove them. You have to tell them, wake the hell up and start acting like a responsible member of society. It's got nothing to do with, it's not got nothing to do with race. It's already got plenty to do with race. But race is always secondary to whatever allegiance allows you to survive. Whatever allegiance allows you to survive and protect what you have. And that's not going to be white supremacy. It's not going to be white nationalism, not by any long streak. In fact, if you go that route, you will all die. That's a fact. I don't think anyone can deny it. I don't know what you want to do about it. And you just have to sort of recognize, look, the most important thinker, I think, to go for if you want to think about how to do it. Oh yeah, Boers did swap sides at a very point. In the 90s, you got a lot of people who crossed over to the ANC, but that's a very shadowy world, that political elites. So knowing exactly what goes on there, there's speculation, but you don't know. Look, the biggest thing I'm going to hammer home here is that there's a fella called I think his name's Douglas Michaelstatter. Let me just check, because his first name, Michaelstatter. Carlo Michaelstatter, a young Italian philosopher. So he said something extremely, extremely useful. So forget all of these big, hairy ideas about like anarcho-capitalism and blah, 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 communism, fascism, all of that. Just throw it away. Because we're not living in the 20th century anymore. We're not living in the 19th century anymore. We're living now. We have these problems. We're not in Europe. We're not in America. We're not in China. We're not in Russia. We're in South Africa. We have these problems. Face your history. Face your community. How do you survive? How do you look after yourself? Okay. So what Michaelstatter said is, he said that there are two ways that we communicate politically. There's rhetoric and persuasion. And rhetoric is big, high-flung ideology. Right? It's all of these kind of like big hard ideas where you say like, well, it's this ism and that ism and this is or that and this, like, so this is white supremacy, or that's racism, or that's communism, or whatever. And sure, some of these can be true in some sense or whatever, but it's no way to go about finding yourself in society, because you're forcing people to cohere to weird mantras that don't really correspond to anything real. What you really need to do as a human being, you're a person who has needs in society. You need to be recognized. You need to be understood. You need to live and breathe and negotiate material needs as well. And all of this has to be done through some level of earnest engagement with the rest of the community. Some people can be persuaded to be on your side. And so don't draw a line at the color bar, because there are black people who will stand up and say, we are willing to fight for the Cape. Do not make a mistake. There are plenty. They may not be the majority, but they exist and they're real. And if you turn away a single ally, we just can't afford it. We cannot afford to turn away a single ally because the cost is too high. And so, yeah. And it's not about like cynical negotiation. You say, look, I'm a human being. I'm standing here. I need this. This is what I need. There's no way that this is negotiable. We don't deserve this treatment, And at the end of the day, you're not going to persuade people like with like ideological mantra. It's very simple. We live here. We deserve to live here. We're not going to be taken away from us. And you got to be serious about it. You got to mean it as like the same way you know that you're getting up in the morning, brushing your teeth, and going to work, or not going to work, as the case may be. The same way that you know you're going to wake up the next morning, you've got to know that you deserve to live there. You've got to know that it's your right. At the most, like no doubt can pass a shadow over your soul. Is there a way you can get up in touch with me? Yeah, you can get in touch with me through Twitter. Yeah, I've got a Twitter handle. I've got my DMs open. I'm pretty chilled in that regard. I'm not going to be taking too many people into my private sort of conversation vibe. I've already got a lot of time I spend on the phone with people in the day back in South Africa. So, which I enjoy immensely, but there's only so much time in the day. But yeah, so yeah, you don't use Twitter. An email. You know what? Okay. Try. Let me try something. Where am I now? I'm in the Netherlands actually. I just finished my master's degree here, and I'm busy trying to figure out a way of coming back. I've been looking at potential jobs and things like that, talking to people who can maybe build a bridge there. But I haven't gotten anything really yet. So it's one step at a time. I mean, I've done a little bit of like freelance work, which has managed to plug a gap. So I've got a little bit of money, but it's not enough for me to like fly down to South Africa on a wing and a prayer, So, which way is the Netherlands going? The Netherlands is interesting because I actually think they're kind of okay. I mean, like they have a very good institutional culture for dealing with not ideological differences, cultural differences. And so they're actually coping fairly bloody well with the minority influx, with the third world influx. You don't see any of the kind of stupid nonsense that you see in other countries, like the Swedes who just say, oh, that's my house. I'm terribly sorry I put it where you were going to, have a fire. Or the Germans who say, well, we must do good for these people and so on and so forth. Or the French who just they haven't got energy, they get angry and then they lie down. Macron's trying his best, but I think it's just going to go sideways. Belgium's screwed, but I think the Netherlands fine. They seem to find a way of like dealing with and incorporating these people, and I think it's possibly because they're country's always been divided to begin with. They had Protestants and Catholics and socialists and liberals and so on, who lived in these like completely isolated pillars of society. Like you'd literally, like, you would go, if you were part of this like little pillar, you'd work for this union, you'd work for this company, you'd go to this school, you'd read this newspaper, you'd live in this area. It would be like these, like, people would walk past each other and never meet. And it's not a big country either. It's like 17 million people now, but like at the time that I'm thinking about, when the heyday of the pillarization, you're talking maybe between 10 and 15, maybe 12 million people. Not a big country. But yeah, very divided by city-states. I mean, like here in Bachen op Zoom, I mean, yoy. But it's no, sorry for Mr. Lewis, but I do not want to give my email out to everyone, if that's okay. I think you possibly contact me through LinkedIn if you want. But probably by my full. There's two. I think there's two accounts. I've got like an old account that I've been locked out of from like when I was at UCT from like 2012 or something, and it's got me with like looking like a terrible mugshot. And then there's another one with me looking like a shoproom mannequin. So go with the one that looks like the shoproom mannequin. Because that one's the one that I actually use. If you want to contact me, LinkedIn, Twitter, but otherwise, yeah, I think I'm going to log off and put an end to this, because I think we've beaten this whole thing to death for these 2 hours. But it's been nice. It's been nice to have some questions coming in. I like that interaction. So yeah, stay sharp and follow Brackenfell. Follow how people cover Brackenfell. That's what you want to do. So just check out, just like read the stories and be neutral and look at it like the weather. You're trying to see, okay, so they're saying these negative things. These are their positions. This is what's generally being said. That's how you pay attention to the tenor of the public conversation. You don't try and fight with every single one of them, because unless you're writing an article against them. If you're writing an article against them, you can do that. But just look at it like the weather. You've got to look at the news as, and the commentary community as like clouds and rain and that kind of stuff. So if you get tied up in whether or not it agrees with you, it's not going to help you. Just, yeah. It'll tell you about the directionality of things. And sometimes it'll give you hope. Sometimes it'll make you feel a bit of despair. But it'll do what it'll do. And yeah, just stay strong and be convinced that you deserve to live there and you deserve to be there, and no one's going to remove you and no one's going to take your shit. And you'll find a way. I have to believe that we will find a way, because there is no other option. And people need to realize that. Just non-negotiable. Non-negotiable. Anyway, cheers.